What does it take to truly live free? Is freedom something we're given or something we must fight to forge for ourselves?
Freedom is not something that is passed on in the bloodstream, as Ronald Reagan said. It's not something that it's inherited. It's something that has to be preserved and fought for generation to generation, or it will die out.
Today, we're sitting down with Alex Ooley, attorney, firearms instructor, and host of the Forge of Freedom podcast. Alex is on a mission to wake people up, to help them think critically, understand their rights, and take responsibility for their own freedom.
I think one of the greatest invasions and threats to individual liberty that we've seen in decades is the reaction to the coronavirus, to COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the threats to free speech and the censorship, the government forced vaccination protocol.
We'll talk about the Constitution, self-defense, and why Alex believes the body of an athlete, the mind of a Stoic, and the spirit of a warrior are essential to building a freer life. If you're ready to challenge the status quo and take control of your future, stay tuned. This conversation is one that you won't want to miss.
We have to realize that if we want to carve out the life we want, the world we want, we have to be actively engaged in that process.
If you're new or watching this as a replay, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Please subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that you can see me or hear my voice. If you don't want to miss another episode of Defenders Live, you can join our free community at defenders-live.com and become a free subscriber. Lastly, if you're looking for exceptional firearms or self-defense training, go to defenders-usa.com and look at their calendar to see what training is coming to you this year. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Defenders Live. I am your host, Lora Thorson. Alex Ooley is an advocate for personal freedom, responsibility, and self-reliance. As the host of the Forge of Freedom podcast, Alex encourages people to think critically, question the status quo, and take control of their own education, especially when it comes to understanding the Constitution and the principles of liberty. Beyond podcasting, Alex is a practicing attorney in the state of Indiana, admitted to the federal district courts for both the northern and southern districts of Indiana. He holds a Juris Doctorate from Indiana University Maurer School of Law and serves as an affiliated attorney with the Armed Citizen Legal Defense Network. His expertise extends into firearms training as a certified defensive handgun instructor and NRA certified instructor in multiple disciplines, including personal protection and home firearms safety. His mission is to equip others with the knowledge and mindset necessary to build a freer life and ensure liberty for future generations. Let's welcome Alex Ooley onto the show. Hey, Alex.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me.
You bet. It's my pleasure. Well, there's a lot of different directions we could go with this interview, and I kind of debated on which rabbit hole I wanted to go down. Since it's your first time on the show, I wanted to just kind of make it some highlights along the way and not go too deep on any one particular thing, which isn't always as fun for me, if I'm being honest. But if we have you back, maybe we can deep dive into one particular thing. Are you game for that?
That sounds good to me.
Okay. I love that. You're such a good sport. So I want to talk about your philosophy about freedom first. You talk about freedom as not being something that's inherited or granted by the government, but something that we forge through our own responsibility as citizens. And so I'm curious if you could expand on that as to what that actually means in practical terms.
Sure. So one of the things that, as you mentioned in the intro, is that I'm passionate about educating people about what it takes to live a freer life. And I think that people have to be actively engaged in striving for a freer life and thereby a freer world, because there is this tendency in the state of nature, so to speak, as is often discussed in political philosophy and in other philosophical works, toward a concentration of power. That is, the people who have more wealth for whatever reason, or have more power because of political connectedness, will tend to accumulate power if people are not actively vigilant against that. And I think that if people are aware of that tendency and try to position themselves in their own lives to mitigate against that, that we can maintain a freer world and a freer life for ourselves as individuals. But one of the things I want to sort of back up a little bit more high level, I suppose. Why do I care? Some people want to be told what to do. Those of us in the firearms community and in the gun rights world typically don't. We're typically of a similar mind, very sort of independent thinkers, and often see eye to eye when it comes to freedom, at least in broad terms. But what I like to start with is this fundamental principle that I think a lot of people don't really think about, at least not actively, is that it all starts with this idea of self-ownership. And that's that what that means is I have a greater right to my own body and to the product of my labor than anyone else, than any other person in this world. And I have a right to defend that. Now, if you're a religious person, if you believe in God, whether that's Christianity or some other religion, you may say, okay, well, God has a greater right to my body than I do, and that would be true. But I'm saying with respect to every other person in the world, you have a greater right to your own body. And very few people, I think, would disagree with that assertion. So what does that mean? What that means is I have self-determination if I choose to do so. If I choose to avail myself of that self-determination. And if I don't, somebody else will do that for me, because there is this tendency to power. And so we have to realize that and take action to guard against that. So that's a roundabout way of saying, starting with the idea of self-ownership, we have to realize that if we want to carve out the life we want, the world we want, we have to be actively engaged in that process.
Wow. That's like, I don't know. I don't think I've ever had anyone like you on the show before, Alex. This is going to be fun. I can tell. I love it.
Good. Well, yeah. and I should say, for those who don't know me, I'm a relatively new podcaster. I care deeply about the right to keep and bear arms. That's part of what I do with the Forge of Freedom. But there are lots of other firearms podcasters out there. There are lots of other attorneys who are podcasters out there about the Second Amendment and about the right to keep and bear arms. I started the Forge of Freedom because I saw that there was a void in teaching people the principles of freedom. And I think a lot of people sort of know them or maybe have some intuition about what, that freedom is a good thing, but don't understand the ideas to defend them in discourse with people who would challenge their beliefs. And so it's my goal to equip people with the sort of foundational ideas and principles to defend the ideas of freedom. And consequently or secondarily, the right to keep and bear arms. Yeah, definitely. So then, what are some of those principles then? Are those some of the practical ways that you're talking about taking action, perhaps? Well, when we talk about principles, we can talk about principles in a number of different ways. There are principles like moral principles, beginning with the idea of self-ownership. And then there are principles that follow from that. That is, typically, if I say that I own myself, I have a greater right to my own body than anyone else, the consequence of that is that no one else can take that without violating a moral principle, whether that's my life, when we're talking about self-defense, or about the product of my labor and the things that I've worked to accomplish and to create. That would be like theft. If I was making a product and somebody took it, that would be theft, and that would be a moral principle that we derive from the idea of self-ownership. So there are lots of principles that follow from the idea of self-ownership. Now, there are other principles that we might say, like the idea or the principle of self-reliance. That's not really a moral principle. That's just a way of living, so to speak. And when I think just sticking with that for a moment, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, because the idea of self-reliance, you can get into the weeds pretty quickly. But when I say self-reliance, I don't mean I'm going to live as a hermit out in the woods by myself and only eat and do the things or consume the things that I create. I mean, developing a community around you, whether that's family, whether that's like-minded people in the gun community or people who grow and compile food together, whether that's through cooperatives or other mechanisms. What I mean by self-reliance is developing a community of people who support each other. And I think that that's incredibly important, because what that does is it reduces the need for government. And government, by its nature, is a forceful entity. So the initial justification for government, and this is going back to sort of foundational political philosophy, is that the government wouldn't be needed if men were, or people were angels. I say men because that comes from a famous quote in the Federalist Papers. But if men were angels, there would be no need for government, right? So the more that we can self-regulate, whether that's through our individual actions or through collective action as communities or cooperatives, the less need there is for outside government to impose its will or rules upon us.
Cool. Wow. This is like, I just have to be honest, because there's a lot of this stuff that I agree with, but you are so well spoken about it and go so deep into it. It's like you're a philosopher and a lawyer combined, and I don't know what to do with you in my head. Do you know what I mean? So, and that's a compliment, by the way.
My bachelor's degree is in philosophy, so that makes sense.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now this is making more sense to me. Yeah. Because you have this, you emphasize on your podcast, this developing the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior, which I agree with. But I wanted you to unpack that a little bit more. Like, what does that philosophy look like in everyday life? And how could one more get closer to encompassing those values?
Sure. So starting with the body of an athlete, obviously, the mind of a stoic would be second, and spirit of a warrior third. I don't list those in any particular order of importance, but I think that they're all very important to having a well-rounded lifestyle, and one that's conducive to creating a freer life. Because number one, starting with the body, and we're getting to like basically the three components of a human being, right? Your body, mind, and spirit. And so I want people, because often people focus on one and neglect the other, and I'm guilty of that as well. And frankly, that was part of my motivation behind starting the Forge of Freedom, as sort of an accountability mechanism for myself to think through these things and to focus on these different areas of my life. But the body of an athlete, I mean, this is going back to creating a life, a community that doesn't need government, that's not dependent. If you have a healthy body, if you have a group of people who have healthy lifestyles, that means you have a life that is less dependent on others to help you. And so again, there's less of a rationale, less of a reason for the expansion of government to support a group of dependent people. Now, of course, you still have children who are born with ill health. You still have people at the end of their life, in their older age, who maybe are not in great health, no matter how well they took care of their bodies throughout their life. But by and large, the majority of your life could be spent in a relatively healthy state if you are a good steward of your body. And that means taking responsibility for what you put in your body, exercising like you should, making sure that you're strong enough to complete the tasks of everyday life and living without the dependency on some outside source. So that's the first thing. The next, the mind of a stoic. What I'm trying to get at here is that we have to focus on, so many people get wrapped up, for instance, in the news day to day. They have their phones in front of them and they have notifications on for every news alert that comes their way. And it's almost always for something they have no control over. And what the Stoics and the Stoic philosophers taught was that we should try to focus on the things that we can control, the things that are within our own environment, the things that we can actually influence. And I think that by focusing on yourself, improving yourself, and then improving the lives of the people around you, whether that's your family or your community, those are the things that you have more influence over and more control over. If I focus on what some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. is doing, I'm going to have this sense of futility inevitably. So the mind of a Stoic, I'm not saying, a lot of people think of Stoicism, they think of somebody who is apathetic or unfeeling, and that's not at all what Stoicism is. Stoicism is focusing on what you can and cannot control and coming to terms with that. So that's the second component. The third is the spirit of a warrior. And the spirit of a warrior comes into to play not only in the realm of the right to keep and bear arms and self-defense, but in the realm of preserving freedom. As we started the show with, freedom is not something that is passed on in the bloodstream. As Ronald Reagan said famously in a quote, it's not something that it's inherited. It's something that has to be preserved and fought for generation to generation, or it will die out. And so I think it takes a certain type of mentality, a warrior mentality, to fight for that, to preserve it, so that no matter what, you're fighting to create a better future for future generations, not just yourself. And I think that's captured. There's a quote that I like, and there's a few different permutations of this, but the idea, Martin Luther is attributed with saying, even if I knew the world would basically be gone tomorrow, or I would die tomorrow, I would still plant an apple tree. And the other permutation of this is that wise men plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit in. And I think that is something that I try to live by even before I had a child myself. I want the world to be a better place when I'm older and when people who come after me are living on in this world.
Well, it turns out, Alex, you and I have quite a bit in common. And it's funny, we both have a podcast, and I think in a roundabout way, we're both trying to do the same thing. Because I talk about on my show much of the time what I consider to be 4 buckets that I feel are important for people who are defenders of life. And those buckets are training, and that can entail a lot of different things, right? Training, physical fitness, emotional fitness, and spiritual fitness. So it's really, I think the way you say it is a lot more poetic than the way I say it, but it's really basically at the end of the day, the same thing, taking personal responsibility and personal accountability for your safety and well-being, caring about your family, implementing things intentionally into your life that not only help your family, but also the community at large, and working together with other people who are also of that same mindset is what it sounds like. And that's the way to a healthier future for all of us, I believe, as a whole.
I totally agree with that. And it sounds, you sound like you're exactly right, that we're coming at sort of the same goal in a slightly different way. But I think all the things that you mentioned are important and captured in a lot of what I'm talking about as well. And going back to sort of the political side of things here, I would consider myself to be a small L libertarian. And by that, I just mean I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party, but I'm a libertarian-minded person. And libertarianism itself starts with the idea of self-ownership. But I'm always for limiting government when and where we can. And part of the reason for that, or part of it comes at it from 2 sides here. We're talking about, making a better life for ourselves, for our family, and for our community. I think that goes hand in hand with limiting government, because government is not needed, like we were talking about at the beginning, if there is more self-reliance, if there are more supportive communities, and we don't have our first instinct, or for so many people anyway, is to say, oh, here's a problem. What can the government do to fix it? And I think we need to get away from that impulse and get back to, how can I fix this? How can my community fix this? And the way I like the way that Brian McClanahan puts it. He's a historian. He's a professor in Alabama. I'm blanking on the name of the college, but he says, think locally, act locally. So instead of asking some congressman in some faraway place to impose your will on your neighbor, why don't you think about how to solve this problem locally? Because if you try to solve the problem with your neighbor rather than asking the government to send police or some other person in to fix it for you, that will create a better environment for everybody. And it will force you to have a relationship with that person, maybe to empathize with that person, even if it's a contentious relationship. And I think we need to get back to that mindset of thinking locally and acting locally.
Yeah, and I've heard that actually a lot more over the last few years than I ever have before. Hey guys, I want to offer you something that is a personal touch, something special that I can share with you to help you grow and develop along this journey in this path as a defender. And what I'm offering is a monthly live call that you can participate in, and we're going to be talking about the 4 areas that I believe all defenders of life should be strong in, and those are physical fitness, emotional fitness, spiritual fitness, and training. So if you're interested in learning about those things and developing yourself throughout that journey, I'm here to help you, and I want my paid subscribers to have that personal touch of getting to talk with me one-on-one in this group call and sharing with others and encouraging others along this path. So if you'd like to get in on those calls, go to defenders-live.com, become a paid subscriber. I cannot wait to see you there. And thank you so much for your support of Defenders Live. I'm curious, kind of along that same line, that kind of led into this next thing. There's a lot of concern about increasing government control and what's happened over the last 4 years, especially in the erosion of personal freedoms with all of the craziness that has been going on. And there's a perception, at least, that some of that is perhaps getting taken care of. Others don't see it that way. Lots of people don't understand what's going on. I'm curious what you think the biggest threats are today to personal liberty, to autonomy, or what has the course been as you see it over the last, decade, let's say? And do you see any course correction at this point, either from what's happening on the federal level or on the local level, as you're speaking about?
So there are so many things we could talk about here. I think just in the last decade, I think one of the greatest invasions and threats to individual liberty that we've seen in decades is the reaction to the coronavirus, to COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the threats to free speech and the censorship and the backdoor sort of coercion of large social media companies by the government. I think that was in sort of this forced vaccination protocol. And I don't want to get too deep into those things, but I think collectively, the reaction to COVID-19 was one of the greatest harms to freedom broadly that we've seen, certainly in my lifetime and probably in many decades. But I think that, thankfully, the silver lining in that is that I think that experience opened up the eyes of many people to the sorts of things that the government was doing and started questioning whether or not the government actually had the authority that it was asserting through that process. Mm-hmm. And so I think that many people have started to question the government and have come to see that we don't need more of this bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. We don't need these people, whether they're elected or unelected, exercising more control or power over our lives. So I'm optimistic in that I've seen, I think, a healthy reaction to the things that occurred during the 2020 to 2023 timeframe, most prevalently. So that's the first thing. I think there is some optimism, and I think rightfully so, with the election of Donald Trump, especially with respect to the right to keep and bear arms. I think that it's been encouraging. We're still early. It's only the end of February. So there's a lot to see yet in terms of what will be accomplished with this administration. But I'm encouraged that there's been a concerted effort to cut a lot of the waste and a lot of the sort of bureaucratic jobs who are largely filled by people who want to exercise control over people's lives and tell them how to live or not to live. So I'm encouraged by that. Of course, we've yet to see how successful they'll be in the long run. I think that the Supreme Court, when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms, is the best court that we've seen in a long time. They're not perfect. There are lots of times I disagree with them. I think that they got Rahimi wrong, for instance, when they issued their opinion with respect to whether or not somebody subject to a civil restraining order should be deprived of their right to keep and bear arms. I think that they got that wrong, but I think that any court that we've had in recent history would have gotten that wrong. And I think that they've been better on the right to keep and bear arms more broadly than certainly would have happened if Donald Trump had not been elected in 2016 and appointed or nominated several of the justices during his first term. So those are good things. They're not perfect results, but those are good things when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms. And then, of course, they took action. The Supreme Court did on the power of the administrative state. I don't know how familiar your listeners are with the Loper-Bright opinion that came out last term, but that basically reined in a lot of what the administrative state has been doing for many decades in the wake of the Chevron case, where there was the Chevron deference, where basically there were these administrative agencies who were tasked with enforcing the law, but when they basically grew out of their original intended purpose, they started creating new law through regulations, essentially, and the Supreme Court reined that in to some degree last term. So those are all good developments for freedom.
I just have to say this. I just appreciate how you unpack everything so clearly. I don't know if you were taught that or if that is just how you are, but I just want to say thank you for that, because that's not always the case with people I have on my show, and it's really refreshing.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I wrote a note down here and I can't read it now, so I guess I won't ask that question. Let's shift gears here just a little bit. I want to get into specifically the self-defense space for a little bit, because you have a lot of experience in this. I believe this is one of the most important topics that people who are everyday carriers should know, which are, we call it the aftermath of a lethal force encounter. I believe that oftentimes people don't think what could happen all the way through, meaning they focus on buying a gun. They might even focus on carrying a gun, but they might not put as much emphasis on learning their laws in their states, and or when they're traveling, learning the laws of where they're going and how their permits reciprocate or don't reciprocate in those areas, which I think is really important to know. And beyond that, just the unbelievable turmoil legally, financially, socially, emotionally that comes after having to defend themselves. I would like to go into that if you're willing. What
Absolutely.
are some of the most important things that people need to think about, consider, and understand practically and legally about the aftermath of self-defense?
Well, I think that you've alluded to this, and I think you've done it very well, that just because a lot of people, they buy a firearm, they may get some training, and they should get some training, whether or not it's required in your state to get a license, or if you're in a constitutional carry state, you should still get training, and you should get as much of it as you can possibly budget for. And I think that people overlook the training component, but then they think, especially if they haven't been trained, okay, I've got my firearm, now I'm good. And as long as I shoot somebody and it's a good shoot, there won't be any repercussions. And that's just not the case at all. And I should say, you mentioned that I'm an attorney. I am an attorney, but I'm a criminal defense attorney. I also practice, included in that is self-defense, and I've handled a number of self-defense cases. So I'm not nothing against real estate attorneys, but I'm not a real estate attorney. I'm not a family law attorney.
You're the guy to ask these questions too.
I practice in this area, and I see the consequences of bad decisions a lot. And I see the consequences of good decisions. And even when you make a good decision, a justified decision, it doesn't mean you won't be charged with a crime, because oftentimes there was nobody there other than you and the person, as Massad Ayoob says, who is doing a very good impression of a victim lying on the ground with blood streaming from their body. Okay? So just because you acted justifiably does not mean you won't get charged, you won't get arrested, and you won't have to sort things out later with an attorney, the police, and the prosecutor. So even if you act justifiably, you may be arrested, you may have to post bond, your firearm may be taken from you, you may have a felony charge, you may have to hire an attorney for tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the level of the charge. So this is not something to be taken lightly. And I think that people often overlook the consequences of even acting justifiably.
Totally agree. Yeah. So where would one begin to get the education needed in order to know the laws in their state? That would probably be a good first step, right? And then maybe I won't ask you two questions at the same time again. How about let's start with that one, then I'll follow up.
So that's a great place to start with knowing the law in your own state. But with that being said, as it relates to whether or not you're acting justifiably in self-defense, there are common principles that apply across state lines. And it's impossible to know the justifiable use of force statute or the self-defense statute and the nuances of that statute in every state that you may travel to.
Right.
And you cannot internalize that and recall what that statute says in the moment where you're faced with a deadly threat. So what I encourage people to do is to internalize some principle, either whether that's the one that's taught by Masad Ayub or Andrew Branca in the law of self-defense or some other mechanism. But what all of these do is try to capture the essence of the self-defense standard that would be applicable nationwide. So Masad Ayub, for instance, he says, am I facing an immediate, otherwise unavoidable threat of death or grave bodily harm to me or another innocent person? And if the answer to that is yes, then you would be justified in using deadly force. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to use deadly force. There's still discretion about whether or not you should use deadly force. But if you can answer yes to that, that would meet the moral and legal standard for self-defense in every state. So you can remember a standard like that in the heat of the moment if you contemplate that, if you think about it, if you internalize what that means. Andrew Branca says, is the threat imminent? Are you innocent? That means I didn't start the fight. Is your response proportional? Did you try to avoid it? And was your response reasonable? Okay, those are the 5 elements of self-defense, according to the Law of Self-Defense, which is a book written by Andrew Branca. I think those are both good standards. I prefer the one that Masad Ayub teaches just because I think it's easier to internalize. But I think that if you want to add or augment your study, I think that Andrew Branca's book is also an excellent resource. So know your state law. I think a great resource for that is handgunlaw.us. It has a great digest. It's not the law itself, but has a great digest of the law in each state, including a reciprocity map. So handgunlaw.us is a great resource, and I know it's updated regularly. I've communicated with the person who manages that website, and I know he does a great job keeping it up to date. And then take some class, read the Law of Self-Defense, take a class with Masad Ayub, take a class with a reputable instructor in your state who may have some instruction on the law of self-defense as it relates to your state. And I know, Lora, you work, you do a firearms instruction in your state there in Montana. Do you have I don't actually know, do you have somebody who teaches the law or a resource there?
So usually what I do is I, at the very least, make sure that I have handed out the most recent version of handgunlaw.us for Montana.
There you go.
And then I encourage them to read it because oftentimes they're not there for that reason, but I feel a responsibility to give them that information during like a handgun fundamentals class. So if the class isn't specifically advertised as talking about the legal portion of it, I still give that to them so that they have it. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great idea. And the handgunlaw.us is, like I said, those digests are just fantastic. I'm an affiliate attorney with the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, so I want to get that disclosure out. But their content is fantastic, and I don't get paid anything as an affiliate. It just puts me on a list for people to contact if they're a member of the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network. But I would still nevertheless recommend their content. They have great educational material. I write periodically for their attorney question of the month, which has, it's a question that they put out to their affiliate attorneys in all the states, and attorneys submit their answers to those questions. So that's a great, their attorney question of the month column is a great resource as well. But if you become a member, they also give you access to a bunch of videos with Marty Hayes, who founded the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, and Masad Ayub, who is one of the most respected experts in the self-defense world on the justifiable use of force. So, and other great experts as well that they've done videos with. So that's also a great resource. There are other great resources, of course, but but those are some of the resources I'd recommend most highly.
Good. I have, well, out of all of that, 3 more questions popped up. So the first one is, which one should I ask first? The first one is, it feels like to me, and I could be mistaken, I don't know if controversy is the word, but definite gray area, I guess, in the space of, I'm not sure what to call it, if you would call it self-defense insurance or whatever you want to label it. Could you explain to people what that is or what I'm trying to talk about here? And then Could you unpack maybe a direction that people could go to decipher for themselves as to what would be best for them?
Sure. So your reluctance is warranted about what to call it, because there are different products. Some of them are insurance, some are not insurance. They are support networks, and that might sound like a distinction without a difference, but there's a significant distinction. Some products are actually underwritten or backed by an insurance policy. So if you buy a product from XYZ post-defense company and you're involved in an incident, the company itself is not paying to support you. It's the insurance provider that they have a contract with. Yeah. There are others that are membership support networks that have nothing to do with an insurance company. It's a group of people, and this is the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network would fall into this category, who pool their money together. And if one of the members is involved in an incident, the money comes out of that pool that the network's members have compiled. So it's not insurance. Mm-hmm. Now, ironically, the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network is in Washington State, which is not particularly gun friendly. And Washington State is trying to say that they are insurance and that they're subject to the same regulations and restrictions as insurance and all these things. So there is some dispute there, but it's not insurance like these other products. So that's really the distinction there. Now, there are lots, I've talked about ACLDN, the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network. There are other great products out there, and I can't say that any of them are better than another. Part of it depends on what you want and how much protection you want to buy. Mm-hmm. Typically, you're paying for what you get, and that sounds sort of obvious, but there are some programs that will post your bond. There are some who will let you pick your attorney. Others will only give you the attorney that they've picked out themselves. Mm-hmm. There are others who will not, if you lose at trial, won't pay for an appeal. Or if you lose, will ask for what's called recoupment, which means you have to pay them back if you lose at trial. So there are lots of differences among these various products, and you just have to try to figure out which product fits your risk tolerance, which product fits your budget, and what you're looking to guard against.
And read the fine print.
Read the fine print. Exactly.
Yeah, that's very well put. Thank you for explaining that. I appreciate it. Mm-hmm. A couple more questions. I have personal experience with some people who I believe think that Castle Doctrine is a free pass, and it bothers me tremendously. So could you explain what Castle Doctrine is and how it's different from being in the public sphere as far as use of lethal force? Sure.
So you're right. There is a lot of confusion about Castle Doctrine and a related doctrine called Stand Your Ground. Mm-hmm. Both concepts do one thing, and that is remove the duty to retreat. So in common law, there was a duty to retreat as far as you could do so safely. Castle Doctrine says if you are in your home, you do not have a duty to retreat. Now, there are variations of Castle Doctrine among the 50 states. Okay, so Indiana's Castle Doctrine will be different than Kentucky's or Montana's, but all Castle Doctrine laws at least do one thing, which is remove the duty to retreat if you're attacked within your own home. Okay. Now, some extend Castle Doctrine, like Indiana, to an attached garage that would be considered part of your home. An occupied motor vehicle is included in Indiana's Castle Doctrine. A concept called curtilage, which is curtilage, is the area around the home where you basically, there's not one definition of this. It's a kind of a vague term, but where sort of the day-to-day private activities of your life are conducted. So that would be like your immediate yard or maybe a patio or a deck, something like that. So laws may vary about what exactly is considered the castle for the purpose of castle doctrine. But at least the most basic definition of it is that it removes the duty to retreat within the four walls of the home. Okay, so that's the castle doctrine. That's all it does. Stand your ground takes that same principle and applies it in the public. And all it does is say, if you're in a public place where you have a right to be, you do not have a duty to retreat. So that's all that stand your ground does. It's not a license to kill. Neither is castle doctrine. All it's saying is that if you're the person being attacked, you don't have to risk the possibility of putting your life in further jeopardy by attempting to retreat. Mm-hmm. That's what the law recognizes. They don't want to put a person in that position where, for fear of being prosecuted because they didn't attempt to retreat, we're going to say, as a matter of policy, you do not have to attempt to retreat. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't. There may be circumstances where you have the ability to do so safely, and that's probably a good idea. But the law is saying we're not going to put the burden on the person to retreat. And I've actually dedicated 2 podcasts to these 2 concepts, one to castle doctrine, one to stand your ground.
This would be a great time to plug your podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
The Forge of Freedom on YouTube.
Yeah, Forge of Freedom. It's on YouTube, it's on Rumble, it's on X, it's on Facebook, and all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. You can also go to forgeoffreedom.com and you can search there for Castle Doctrine or Stand Your Ground, and you'll find those 2 episodes that are dedicated to these concepts. I unpack each in a more lengthy podcast to give you a better understanding about what they both mean. But what I've said here is the basics of both.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for doing that. That's really important. I think this is a question, at least when I've heard it asked to other attorneys, they don't seem to like to answer it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The question is, depending on who you ask, it seems as though attorneys have differing opinions on once a person has had to use lethal force to defend themselves or others, and the cops have shown up. The question that I've heard before is, should someone not say anything, or if they say anything, how much should they say to law enforcement? And I've gotten lots of different responses about this. So I'm curious what your opinion is.
Sure. I'm happy to answer the question. So I subscribe to the advice that Massad Ayoob gives on this. And you're right, there is a lot of disagreement in the legal world about what the best approach is. I think that as a general rule, the answer is you shouldn't talk unless you've done some reading, taken a class about what you should expect when the police arrive. But that being said, if you understand what limited things you should say, I think that can be very beneficial to you and your potential case. Or if you say the right things, you establish the active dynamic, as Massad Ayoob would say, may result in no prosecution of your case at all, which is a huge win. So my advice would be, if you've had the proper training, it would be beneficial if you could say a little. You don't want to vomit at the mouth and say too much, because in the heat of the moment, right after the fact and the aftermath, there is a tendency to say too much. And the reality is you don't fully understand minute details in the aftermath. So you won't recall necessarily distances. You won't recall times. You won't recall maybe what other people may have been around necessarily. So you don't want to get into too much detail about those sorts of things. But if you can establish what's called the active dynamic, which is that person attacked me, I had to defend myself, that's his weapon, there's my gun, there's a potential witness if you did notice a witness, those sorts of things, I think that goes a long way to, if not preventing your case from ever getting filed against you, to helping your attorney get it dismissed at an early stage. That being said, if you haven't studied these incidents and what they entail, because here's the thing, thinking about how these go down ahead of time from real world incidents helps you anticipate what it's going to be like. Now, no incident's the same, but it helps you anticipate what it's going to be like if it happens to you. Mm-hmm. And it helps prevent like a mind fog or a panic or what some people would call a surreal experience. I never thought this could happen to me. It was surreal, right? No, I knew this could happen, and I knew what to do. That's the mindset that you want to have. Mm-hmm. And so if you've studied enough ahead of time about how to respond justifiably, and what limited things you should say, I think that's the best approach. Now, if you haven't, then you should just not talk and assert your right to remain silent.
Very good, Alex. Wow. I really appreciate you coming on. I'm trying to think if I've had an attorney on before. I'm sure I haven't had a criminal defense attorney on before. So it's really, really good. This information is so needed. These are just the basics, guys. Like there is so much more to it than this, but at least if this much gets in a person's brain, I think this is a good start to helping them protect themselves. And again, you unpack it so well. And so that's very much appreciated. You guys need to go to the Forge of Freedom podcast and listen to Alex for sure, or forgeoffreedom.com. And he's on Facebook, X, and Instagram. Any final thoughts? Anything we missed? Alex?
There's a lot we could talk about, no doubt. But I think you're right that this is a good start for people who have an interest in this subject. And I think, my dad's an attorney as well, and I've done a number of episodes with him where we sort of hash out concepts like this, and what you should say in the aftermath, who should call 911, and what you should say on the 911 call. Yeah. We talk about castle doctrine and stand your ground, obviously, among many other concepts. So you can find all that at forgeoffreedom.com.
Really appreciate your time today. It was a pleasure having you on.
Yeah, it was great chatting with you, Lora.